Otherwise, they're very similar to cereal boxes. This one's a little bit old, but they have the name of the product, at least well enough to be shown. They have a celebrity often on the cover, whether it's Trix the Bunny or Beyonce. And they have various come-ons about what you will find inside that product, whether it's 618 pages of spring dresses or 25% of your nutritional needs. All of these are accomplished by the package that is the cover. And while these components can move around and shift a bit, they're often there, at least in some or greater extent. Now, I'm going to talk about a few strategies for cover design, and one of those, which is probably the most common for newsstand magazines, is what I refer to as the hanger cover. And in this case, you have a person in the middle of the cover, and then the headlines are kind of hanging off of that person. They're used as kind of an organizational device. And the picture for your cover is really kind of the grid for your design work. The picture provides the structure and the information about where you could put type. So in this case, Nicole Kidman is on the cover of this cover, and the little bit of a swoop in her body is creating places for the type. So the biggest headline, and you note that it's not the upper left cover line, but it's the biggest one, and so we know that this is the one that it goes with, is sort of in that larger area carved out by her hips. And then we have 9 Inch Nails in the smaller area, and it is being organized very much around her. Now, I should say that this cover, probably, you're looking at probably $50,000 worth of money on this cover, because Nicole Kidman and her entourage had to be flown to wherever it was taken. She probably did not provide a whole lot of time, maybe a half hour or an hour to get this done. So there was a lot of prep work that had to be done. There had to be a photographer, of course. And if you're going to take a photograph of Nicole Kidman, you're not using a discount photographer. You want to make sure you get that photo right in the time you have to get it. And she also has a very carefully chosen background with this dark brown, which is interesting enough to provide, a little bit of visual interest, but not so interesting that it's a hard surface to put type on. The type, because it's relatively neutral, the type can all be light color because the background is all dark color. If you have a background that has more variety, it can be harder to find places to find type. And to get a background like that, it had to be scouted, someone had to find it, or it had to be built. A lot of times for a bigger magazine shoot, they will actually build a set to make that shot. And then other little details like the leather pants that match the color of her hair, the hat with the band that provides a little bit of burst of color, and modesty. All of that was very carefully chosen and figured out ahead of time, or they may well have had other options. And so to get this look, Nicole Kidman certainly had someone to do her hair and makeup. There was a couple of lighting people. The art director of the magazine was probably present for the shoot to make sure that stuff was usable coming out of it. And when you get that many people, maybe you have a caterer. So maybe you have a second lighting assistant. So a cover like this is very expensive, and it's hard to do that on a student budget. You can give it a try by all means, but I also want to show you some other strategies besides the hanger cover. And here's a kind of a less successful example of a hanger cover, I think. In this case, the type is battling a little bit with the background. It's not coming from the background, and there are so many different typefaces and changes that it becomes a little bit confusing or just overwhelming. Somewhere between that last cover and this one, though, there are more successful covers. Of type in harmony with its image, and this is actually a local magazine, a local political magazine. There are several in town. This one happens to be on the libertarian side of the spectrum, and it is, last I knew, I assume still in DuPont Circle. And this was on the left an actual cover they did. And this is a cover that I think is the type and image is not in harmony. And literally, sometimes literally, that means that the two are blocking each other. But in this case, I think that uh, the type and is just a distraction from the picture. You ideally want your picture and your typography to work together to tell some sort of a unified story. And I think that part of it, I think there's a tendency, which is often misguided, to take type if it's on the left side of the page and just make it flush left. And if it's on the flush right on the right side of the page, make it flush right. And I think that often creates like little distracting areas in the middle where these kind of almost fingers of type are poking at each other, and it's creating this awkward shape in the middle. And also, this cover, the original, has what I would describe as a very weak hierarchy, which is to say there just isn't a lot of visual difference between the major headline and the secondary stories. I think the secondary stories are about the same size as the deck is for the main story. And all of that makes this cover a little bit muddled. I think there's nothing wrong with that, but I read that anyway. And so they happen to have the same picture. I assume it's a stock photo or a news photo. In the magazine, it ran twice, so I redid the cover in a way that I thought would be a little bit more balanced. It allows this picture to do its job and tell its story. So here we have a much simpler hierarchy, primary. This is probably the second most important. And then these share the job of being the third most important, and more importantly, the house, the sort of distressed house, which is kind of a cool, kind of a spooky picture from the time of the housing bubble crash a few years ago, is allowed to do its job with the type as well. But these solutions are not always intuitive or easy until you start working with an image. But images that give you a place, a clear figure-ground relationship, and a place to put your type are easier images to make covers out of. There's no law that says a cover needs to have 100 lines on it. This is Cine Action, and this cover gets its power from a little bit of a drama in it. So don't feel like, that's part of, and I'm going to talk more about branding in a minute, but that's part of the brand of your magazine, is not just the logo, but how you use type and how type works with the picture. And in this case, the drama of this picture and the understated type treatment work to make a fairly pleasing and successful cover. Typography can also be an effective way to make a cover, no image, or basically no image, and just using words. Words, if they're letters, if they're well designed, if they get big, can be attractive, and this is creating kind of interesting negative spaces in it. This was part of two covers. Sometimes newsstand magazines will do multiple covers because they hope they'll get more display space that way. They'll get two rows of magazines, so it'll become sort of like a poster for the publication. And they also hope that people will buy both covers to get both covers if they're a fan of the magazine. And so this came with another cover, which I unfortunately don't have, but it was the reverse. Instead of a smiley face, it had a frowny face, and it said "betrayed by work," and then in small letters it said "or inspired." And in that case, the yellow guy was on a black background, and so it was kind of a cool pair. And probably no one would buy two copies of Fast Company, or not many people would, but TV Digest, when that was out, used to do that a lot. They'd focus on a TV show and they'd do all the main characters from that show on a different cover, and some collectors would fall for that or do that. And the other thing that's kind of cool about this cover is the way the UPC is incorporated as kind of like the mustache almost of the smiley face. Now, I should say that if you want to use a UPC on your cover to get that newsstandy look or for uh, uh, that verisimilitude. You can if you want, but you do not have to. That's entirely up to you if you want to leave that clean. But your covers should probably have at least one headline, and it should have your date and any other information. Date and price certainly would be at a minimum. Now, talking about UPCs, uh, uh, if you do have one, I would say keep it at 100%. Don't make it exaggerate the size. And I would say that if you look at this UPC, Universal Product Code, it looks a little bit different than the ones you'll see on cans of beans or soup. It has this little sidebar on it, and we can see that has an 11 in it. And by that 11, I know that it is the it's November issue. Does it say September? No, it says November issue. Because magazines like to know not just how many copies they sold in a year, but how many of each month's copy got sold. And that is very useful information because over time you start to learn some things about what makes a cover a bigger seller than another. And if a magazine sells 1,000 more or 2,000 more or whatever the number is, that's fairly substantial income for the magazine because you've already invested all the money in printing and distributing and converting 1,000 more of those copies in the sale. It gives you that money from the sales, but it also gives you the basis for advertising. It's part of your circulation. So over time, you might learn things that celebrities on your cover tend to sell more copies. That is generally true that celebrities do. You might learn that women sell more copies than men. You might learn all kinds of things over time. I once interviewed for a job at a place that did science fiction magazines, and what their takeaway was that rockets did better than robots. They apparently didn't think of any other possibility for the cover of their magazines, and then they eliminated robots because the rocket covers, the spaceship covers, did about 1,000 other more copies at the newsstand than the robot covers. Another example of kind of a nice typographical cover. Wired magazine did this a few years ago, and it looks on screen pretty close to what the cover looked like because it was printed with fluorescent ink, and fluorescent inks get you a little bit of a brighter burst of color than you can get with just ordinary process CMYK. Oop. And so it had this like almost like these were stickers on top of that cover sort of look, which was kind of neat. And the money they saved with images, not having an image, not paying for an image, not paying for that sort of thing, probably you could at a lot of magazines boost your budget enough for the extra ink colors, or more than enough. Wired tended to do a lot of fluorescence anyway, and metallics. Another style of poster is, in the trade, it's called the poster cover. And this would be an example of that. This is the work of Janet Frodish when she was at the New York Times Magazine, and I thought she had just tons of really inventive covers particularly, but also interiors for the magazine. And so this is one of her covers from then. So Bill Clinton's Legacy, the first draft, not a lot of type, very simple cover, but the image and the type are working together. And I think it's kind of bold and surprising to blur out a photograph. It takes a little bit of courage to do that. But in this case, the blurriness, I think, is talking about the first draft. I mean, another term for first draft is rough draft. And if you think about it, something sketched in, or if you're doing a drawing, putting in the details and establishing the locations first. And this is not literally that, but it sort of speaks to that kind of aesthetic. Here's another of hers. It's So You, a woman wearing her own face on her dress for a package about how people use clothing essentially to brand themselves and how to communicate who they are and to who they want to talk to. And also, illustration is a perfectly acceptable thing for a cover. I've shown no illustrated covers up to now, but I personally like illustration a lot on covers. I picked this one for this trade show because it's all fairly simple illustrator skills. I mean, it was certainly time consuming to make this, but it's probably within the technical range of most people in the class. If you want to do an illustration for your project, and it doesn't have to be the cover, it could be somewhere else, that is one of the optional projects for this class for scoring points. And not quite finally, but almost finally, a cover can get to be so famous that it makes a influence over time. George Lois was a ad man, mostly an advertising designer, but he agreed to do Esquire's magazine covers, just the covers. And as I said, a cover is essentially a package or essentially an ad for the magazine. At least a newsstand cover is. It's trying to get you to pick up that cover and buy it, and it's trying to intrigue you. And so here we have so George Lewis did this almost the entire 1960s. And here's one of his more famous ones, and you could look up his name if you want to see others. You'll find lots of examples of them on the web. But here we have the final decline and total collapse of the American avant-garde. And you take away the picture and the type, but I mean, you take away the type and you could probably get away with it because the image itself is intriguing. As he was one of the first celebrity artists, so everyone knew who he was and what he was famous for. And sometimes people will, that cover is famous enough that you can just borrow it and people will know what you were talking about, or at least a lot of people. So here we have the final decline and total collapse of the Southern Arterial System, starring Paula Deen drowning in Duke's mayonnaise. This was before she was disgraced, but I thought it would be worth showing for that connection. Now, the other thing to think about when you're doing covers is branding, and some students in this class will be just using the existing brand for the magazine, and that is perfectly fine, but I do want to talk about branding a bit for those who are doing it themselves. This is kind of a fun brand. This was the inaugural issue of Russia magazine, which I bought a few issues of. It didn't last very long. And at the time, or not long after that, we associated Russia with the Soviet era, which was known for scarcity and long lines. And so I thought it was kind of fun, almost like someone had taken this logo and put it together out of mixed type. They had to sort of improvise because they couldn't get a consistent name. So it sort of spoke to the idea of Russian history. It was kind of a fun way to brand this. I'm showing this branding, which I designed and then also replaced, but this is a logo I did for Washington City Paper, and I'm showing it not because it's the greatest logo ever, but because I can talk about it and what went into it to turn type into a logo. And so this is the actual typeface below. If you just set that typeface, it's called Scala. And if you just set it, that's how it comes out. And then it distorted it to be a little bit tighter and a little bit bolder. I think I put a stroke around it, which I wouldn't do unless I was prepared to spend a fair amount of time refining it after that. And then this is the final logo. And so you'll see a lot of things that were funky in the original got eliminated. So one of those things is the Y does not quite line up with the T. And you say, why doesn't the Y line up with the T? Well, the Y has to look good next to every other character in that alphabet that it might appear. And that was a compromise. That's the sort of compromise if you're designing something like a typeface that you have to make, because you can't always choose what characters will go next to each other. The big difference with a logo is you can choose. You can make that letter look good exactly next to the characters it went to. And so that's regularized. You could see these descenders are shortened so they didn't dangle into the images so much. They're still there to make it readable. And if you look closer, you'll see a lot of other kind of things that are uh, almost funky, but you don't notice them because they work in the context of the logo. So one of the things I'd point out is the lowercase I, and if you look at it, the serif at the bottom is substantially shorter on the left side than the right side. And if you take that letter out as a freestanding character, it looks funky, but in the context of the logo, it just looks like it's evenly spaced between the two letters it is next to. And the same is true in a couple of other these places where serifs were shortened. Oh, I think the R is as well, or changed a little bit to meet the needs of that logo. So that's one of the cool things about logo design is even if you're starting with an existing typeface, you can really work it and make it into kind of a perfect thing that stands on its own. Um, Probably if I was doing this today, I'd make the T a little bit shorter, but apart from that, I'm still fairly happy with this logo. Branding, of course, extends to beyond the logo itself. Um, this is a case where I think the original Martha Stewart Living logo, I'm not positive if they're still using it or not, doesn't really seem like it goes with the brand. It's a grotesque font, that category of sans serif, and it's just kind of plopped there. It doesn't seem particularly elegant about it. But if you look at the understated type treatment and you look at uh, the soft colors and the soft focus and just how soothing this is, it just seems so perfect for the Martha Stewart brand. It has just such elegance. I think of Martha Stewart as a magazine for people who want to live as if they had servants but can't afford them, and so just this picture is just so perfect and so soothing, and it just seems so luxurious. And even the way uh, the the ribbons of the napkin kind of mimic the plate, the scalloped plate that this is sitting on. It just seems so perfect, and of course none of this happened by accident. There are uh, cooks who make food, but there are also food stylists who make sure it looks really good when it's photographed, and the photographers who light it. All of this is very intentional and very carefully done. And I've done food shots a couple of times, and even the relatively simple ones just take a few hours. They are a lot of work. And a brand can be very different. This is a magazine called Urban Land, and I think here the type is a little bit more compatible with the brand, and I think the image is also has this really nice urban vibe. The mannequin that we are looking at through a store window, so we don't have a sense of city. But we have city implied because this is like a hip store window in a hip town. So that's the other thing to think about is how your type and your images project your brand.